Hey you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 32, season 2. For the first time since I've been doing this podcast, I have a repeat guest on, one of my absolute heroes in the no-till world, Mr. Bryan O'Hara. We're going to talk about composting. We're going to talk about nutrient balancing, about a subject that has not really received enough love or really talk on this podcast, biodynamics. And Bryan, of course, just wrote a new book called No-Till Intensive Vegetable Culture, Pesticide-Free Methods for Restoring Soil and Growing Nutrient High-Yielding Crops. It is wonderful. It's a Chelsea Green book, so we're going to talk about that as well. Now, to be sure, I will reiterate in this conversation, but Bryan's book is not about biodynamics. But biodynamics definitely inform the book. And so we do a little primer about what biodynamics is and talk about some of his views on the subject and how he feels it goes well with Korean natural farming. I could, of course, not bring you this week's episode without the help of our show sponsors like BCS America.
You already know about the legendary versatility of BCS two-wheel tractors on the small farm. You know it's the most economical and time-saving choice for market farmers, building beds with the rotary plow, mixing amendments with the power harrow, and mowing cover crops with the flail mower. But a BCS two-wheel tractor can do much more beyond the small farm. BCS powers more than 40 high-quality PTO-driven attachments, each with the power and performance of an all-gear drive transmission. Blow snow with BCS's snow thrower, also known as the snow cannon. Chip and shred debris with the chipper shredder. Clean your property with the pressure washer. Irrigate your lawn or garden with the high-pressure irrigation pump. Haul over 800 pounds, including yourself, with a rideable utility trailer. And now, spread compost evenly over 30-inch beds with the all-new spreader attachment. Yep. BCS is pretty much the Swiss Army knife of power equipment. Check out bcsamerica.com for the latest attachments, videos, promotions, and more. That's bcsamerica.com.
Also supporting the show today, Farmers Web.
Farmers Web software makes it easier for your farm to manage working with your buyers. By lessening the administrative load and increasing efficiency, Farmers Web helps you save time, reduce errors, and work with more buyers overall. Our free account includes features to manage your real-time and coming-soon product availability, and tools to create your own availability calendar to inform buyers on the seasonality of your products. The free account also includes access to the Farmers Web Guide to Working with Wholesale Buyers, which offers pro tips and best practices on how to work with restaurants, schools, and other similar buyers. A 1-month free trial is available of the paid account, which includes features to manage your customers and orders, give select buyers special pricing and payment terms, track your buyers' payments, send invoices, keep detailed sales records, and much more. You can even manage orders for buyers who don't place them online. Access a demo video and learn more at farmersweb.com.
Big thanks to our show supporters and enough from me. Nothing to do with coronavirus this week. I think we could all use a break. Now, let's get to this amazing follow-up conversation with Bryan O'Hara of Tobacco Road Farm. Bryan O'Hara, welcome back to the podcast.
Great. Good to be here, Jesse.
And it's great to have you. So I wanted to have you back on for a number of reasons. I always enjoy our chats, but you wrote a new book, No-Till Intensive Vegetable Culture, which I think is exceptional. And I want to talk about that, but one of the things, I think this is a good place to start, one of the things that definitely seems to inform the book quite a bit is something that we haven't really talked about on the podcast, and that's biodynamic agriculture. So I'm wondering if we can kind of kick off this conversation with a little primer on what biodynamic agriculture is.
Oh, sure. So, probably most people are familiar enough, but I'll just review some of the real basics. So, biodynamic agriculture basically came out of a European-centered spiritual movement called Theosophy or the Anthroposophical Society, and who had a very brilliant kind of leader in the early 1900s named Rudolf Steiner. And so Rudolf Steiner was extremely well known for his influence on numerous different kind of overall societal and educational and health topics. And so basically at some point in the 1920s, the farmers in his circle and Europe in general were basically requested his input into agriculture. And so eventually Rudolf Steiner addressed a group of farmers, and that became known as the agricultural lectures. And basically the farmers wanted to have his input on why their soils and crops were experiencing rundown and less health and vitality than they had previously experienced. And so Rudolf Steiner addressed them in a week-long lecture series. And that lecture series became very influential in forming what is known as biodynamic agriculture. So that was kind of the seed of it. And Rudolf Steiner gave a lot of different recommendations of different things to basically increase the vitality of the crops using different spiritual, scientific concepts that his organization and he himself had studied. So it's biodynamic agriculture is basically rooted in kind of a combination of spiritual and scientific study, which sets it apart from a lot of other agricultural methodologies which are less spiritually oriented. So it is, the organic method doesn't really have a spiritual base to it. It's more just based on traditional methods, a little bit of scientific input over the years, whereas biodynamics developed out of much greater spiritual input with the addition of further developments in both science and spirituality over the years. So it's often thought of that biodynamics is really the strongest spiritually based agricultural methodology that is commonly practiced across the surface of the earth at this point. So since Rudolf Steiner's lectures, of course, there's been, that was 100 years ago now, the organization has moved kind of biodynamics forward. There's incredible amounts of information, particularly coming out of Europe, to help that whole system evolve. Biodynamics and the whole overarching greater movement around biodynamics is very good at studying the wholeness of basically God's creation and being able to bring the perspective of wholeness into our practices on how we actually operate on our farms. So it's basically it's a very thorough study of the interaction of all of creation, and that has tremendous ramifications for how we handle our farming operations. And it's kind of, the holistic thinking of something like biodynamics is kind of the opposite of the scientific model, which has become so dominant, where the scientific model generally tries to build from the minutia, the small details, and build from the study of isolated conditions of repeated, replicated study, and kind of build a world picture from the bottom up. So the two, offer, and that, of course, Rudolf Steiner and myself included, really appreciate having both methodologies, both a great worldview of the interconnectedness, which of course resists the scientific method of study, and also bringing in what could be gleaned from scientific study into kind of like a balanced approach towards agriculture. So I guess that's, and I don't really consider myself a biodynamic expert or anything like that, but I've certainly read tremendous amounts of Rudolf Steiner's works, and we've worked with biodynamic preparations over the years and found them very effective. And, of course, as I was saying, that world holistic view and just the study of nature has been very useful coming from kind of a biodynamic perspective in terms of improving crop growth, and especially in these difficult times where the natural systems are so challenged.
Yeah, I agree. And I always I have this long held affection for biodynamics. I first learned about it when I was working in wine. It was actually one of the things that inspired me to get into farming. The farm where I interned, Bug Tussle Farm, they were a biodynamic farm. So that was, so I have a lot of affection for it. But I've noticed that it doesn't seem as popular with the younger farmers as other practices, or just no sort of kind of, well, as other practices like Korean natural farming is one that's really popular right now. But biodynamics hasn't really taken off quite the same way with the younger generations. What I'm wondering if you could maybe, but I guess my question for you is like, do you see an overlap between these two kind of styles of farming? Because I know you do a lot of Korean natural farming techniques as well.
Yeah, and I would say, they are a very effective combination of methodologies. So and we really appreciate Korean natural farming as well, and the information that has come in from basically the East, because Korean natural farming had a lot of Japanese influence into it too. And I must say, that Cho in Korean natural farming is Cho is a pretty spiritual individual too, which is not to just, write off the spirituality of Korean natural farming, because it really is based in a lot of just the importance of the connection to God. And, Cho writes about that in his manuals. But Korean natural farming is a little different in that it is more based in just practicalities, and the practices are just easier to understand, less, maybe we should call it esoteric. So they're pretty straightforward, and they're understandable to even a completely unspiritually minded individual, even though they themselves are rooted in an understanding of wholeness and God's creation and things like that. So it's certainly more approachable, and for a majority of people, particularly in this country. So, however, I really, really appreciate the combination of the two. It's almost, to me, like the best of the East and the best of the West, and to kind of integrate them in this country where East and West often meet seems particularly appropriate. So now, and so that being said, biodynamics, of course, has incredible popularity in other regions of the world, but has really, like Europe and Australia and India, but for various reasons, biodynamic agriculture has had a very difficult time establishing in this country. And I'm not really sure why that is. I mean, it hasn't been presented well in general. It's not been well explained. The American maybe were just too scientifically minded, can't really grasp older spiritual concepts as well as maybe some other societies. Yeah, I'm not really sure why it hasn't taken hold, but no reason not to bring it along, because of course it is pretty has had tremendous impact, certainly in our farming operation, and it's directly observable. A lot of the preparations and concepts put forth in biodynamics, can be certainly observed, tested, and improvements noted under the biodynamic system as well. And I must say, Rudolf Steiner, one thing about biodynamics that I really appreciated is that Rudolf Steiner was an extremely open-minded individual, and he did not want his recommendations to be taken as dogma or written down in stone like this is the way. He was simply offering a pathway for further development. And so, he's a very flexible spiritualist. He wasn't like, you have to, only Christians can follow this, only Buddhists can follow this. It was a spirituality. It reminds me very much of Unitarianism, very much we're all in this together. However you approach the spiritual world is valid. And here are some ideas from that kind of, overarching, we can all agree on the spiritual world and its influence, whatever denomination you're coming from. So, I think people don't really, they're kind of off-put maybe because they don't understand that it's not really a dogmatic spiritual religious approach. It's very flexible, and I'm sure Rudolf Steiner would be very pleased if any of his practices assisted any person, regardless of spiritual nature, in their agricultural endeavors. So, I just like to bring up that it was a very flexible, not scary, spiritual approach to agriculture as well.
Yeah, I love that. And there's a lot in there. Like, I think that biodynamics, one of the things you said was why it hasn't taken off in the United States. And I've thought about that too. I think it's really hard to distill it down to just a sentence, like what it is. I think that's part of it. But I also think the literature that it has existed has not been as effective. And I don't want to paint the wrong picture of your book, because it's not a book about biodynamics. It's a book about farming and no-till farming in particular. But you do a great job, in my opinion, of kind of inserting some of these biodynamic principles without the dogma and without it feeling so heavily weighted with that esotericism. And I'm wondering if you could describe some of the specific ways you've utilized it or still utilize it on your farm, biodynamic preps.
Yeah, so, just there is, Rudolf Steiner basically presented, I think, like 7 basically herbal preparations to enhance both composting and growth of vegetables in the fields. So it's he has very kind of specific recommendations for how to create these basically inoculants that have certain influences over growth in the field and development of compost. And those, we certainly use those preparations, and they're very useful. But really what is greater was to understand how Rudolf Steiner kind of developed those preparations and kind of why they are effective. So what that gets into is getting back to that, he developed those preparations out of this holistic world view where he had the ability to see the influence of so many different materials and the forces of nature, and he was able to develop specific materials that would have dramatic influence on development of crops and vitality in the fields. So it's really those overarching principles which I find very useful that came out of biodynamics for me. And so to understand, essentially, a lot of the book is about the balance of growth in the forces of nature and the forces of the fertilization materials, and how our agricultural methods and practices influence the, the growth and characteristics of plants. And so a lot of the book discusses the balance of forces of and when it comes to plant growth. Just simple examples are the response of crops to grow to a large size, or the response of crops to begin fruiting and developing seed. And so those concepts of large growth of plants and the flowering response are common agronomic practices. Like, we all understand those. Well, it's well understood in agricultural circles how to influence crops in either direction through agricultural practices, through fertilization materials. But those are really the two oppositional forces. And so those forces in nature are manifested as, positive and negative in electromagnetic fields, the force of gravity and the repulsion from gravity of levity, the male and the female entities. And so we basically experience the division of force into two oppositional forces all the time. And those two oppositional forces manifest in our crop growth in that manner, just as a simple example of either delayed flowering and sizing or flowering and fruit production. So what basically I was able to do over the years has been, since I had a good grasp on biodynamics and the wholeness of the oppositional forces that are experienced on just all kinds of physical levels, combined with a good understanding of agricultural practices, and in particular modern agronomic practices, and also a good grasp of biological developments in the soil through Korean natural farming and various other study of soil biology, I basically came to realize that everybody is essentially talking about the same thing. Like, when you're talking about the two forces agronomically with fertilizers, we're going to apply nitrogen and calcium, so we're going to get big sizing on crops, or we're going to apply phosphorus and sulfur, and we're going to get various acids, and we're going to get ammonia. We're going to get a flowering response from our crops. Well, the biological people, or people studying biology, often refer to that as fungally dominated soils or bacterially dominated soils. So, and of course, the bacteria are thriving in the high nitrogen environment, and the fungal organisms are thriving under the low nitrogen, low nitrate environment. And then of course, in composting, basically, we're talking about, often you hear about the nitrogen to carbon ratio. And of course, that nitrogen to carbon ratio impacts the same things. It's going to, the high nitrate levels are going to encourage a bacterial development in the compost pile. The high carbon materials are going to develop a high fungal activity in the compost pile. So I just saw the same pattern repeating over and over again. So the biodynamic people, we're talking about the calcium to silica ratios in the field, or the calcium to silica polarity. And so I just saw that I was studying all these different methodologies, and including Korean natural farming is talking the same language. Everybody's saying the same thing. So I was able to, through my understanding and study of all these different methodologies, I was able to get an even greater picture of how to influence these conditions by kind of coalescing all the input from all kind of modern agricultural methodologies. And so the synthesis of that, which of course we've been working with on the farm, and then of course replicating it through experiments and trials and study over these years, led me to all different agricultural practices to influence those kinds of things. So through our own personal experimentation, we were able to develop a lot of the systems even further. And of course, which of course is leading to insect and disease resistance, high quality in the crops, and of course led us down the road of no-till. And so eventually, because we had amassed so much practical details of how to achieve these things with a greater a thorough understanding of kind of the concepts behind the practices, that it was time to just write a book about it in order to introduce kind of like a modern evolution of these various concepts in kind of a greater, kind of combined methodology.
When I first read it, I was thinking, this is a really great and thorough book about no-till agriculture. But even if you kind of extract that no-till part, it's just a really well-rounded book about agriculture in general. And one of the things, and I love how you just talked about all the balances, because I think that's something that you do really well in the book, and it's very well executed. And I'm wondering, like, one of the things that kind of leads me to is thinking about you do a section on kind of about fertilization, and it's about between, the kind of differences between fertilizing the soil and fertilizing the crop. Can you talk a little bit about the differences there and what the two kind of approaches are?
Oh, sure. So a lot of, so obviously the pursuit often for crop growth is to achieve this essentially a state of balance that I was discussing, a very high functioning, but also balanced state for a lot of crop growth. So, and that's just the general plan for most vegetable crops. So we handle the fertilization of the field soils to basically establish a very highly functioning biological cycle that is essentially has a pretty balanced force in terms of the polarities of growth and reproduction and things like that. So we basically try to bring the soils into that state through pre-plant fertilization and numerous other, of course, agricultural techniques too, but we'll just talk about fertilization here. So, that would be cover cropping, tillage, how you handle the soils as well, but let's just talk about fertilization. So for pre-plant fertilization, we are usually just apply a compost material, and the compost is, and we apply probably about 30 tons of compost a year to most of the soils over multiple cropping cycles, just as a rough estimate. But the compost and also mulch materials, a lot of organic mulch materials are applied as well. But the compost is designed to basically feed the soil microbiology and establish that balance. So when we're applying the compost and manufacturing the compost, our minds are really about feeding soil and establishing overall field balance. So a lot of the mulch materials and the compost materials are aimed at increasing the cycle of decomposition and just in the mineral application. Say, we need calcium or we need magnesium or we need a trace element for kind of overall broad field balance. It all goes into the composting system. The minerals are activated through the high biological activity, because a lot of them are, of course, rock powders that are relatively inert in biological systems. So, getting the rock materials, the minerals into the composting system helps to bring them into an active state, and those materials are applied onto the field pre-plant. So that establishes just a strong base of strength of biological activity. We are not particularly aimed at fertilizing the plant for, say, sizing or flowering at that point. We're just increasing the whole soil activity and creating a general state of mineral balance at that point. So, and that's important for a few different things. Like particularly, you don't want to overfeed a young plant because it has a big tendency, of course, towards lushness and weakness, especially if you get into too much nitrogen, that kind of side of force of growth. So it's really, a lot of carbon materials and kind of a slowly but well-fed soil microbiology that we're looking to, the materials are developed to kind of slowly, steadily feed, wood chip and leaf and straw, a lot of those kinds of high carbon, but yet somewhat slowly decaying materials for a nice, slow, even, increased food source for the soil. So then once the plant is actually up and growing, the main fertilizer is applied as side dressed. Once the plant is moving, usually, it's getting its basic frames built. It's starting to try to put on a significant amount of mass. For, say, a simple example is a cabbage crop. So the cabbage crop has got 8 or 10 leaves, and it's hitting that point where it's going to start sizing pretty quickly. That's the time we're going to come in with a side-dressed fertilizer material that is meant to bring that crop into just a large size. Obviously, you want to keep a cabbage crop from going into flowering, so those materials are meant to size the crop. So there's calciums, there's nitrogens, in a balanced kind of profile, but definitely more emphasis towards. So it's a complete fertilizer, but more emphasis towards the nitrogens and the calciums, which bring upon a lot of sizing and delay flowering. So the side dress fertilization is really where we start to influence the polarities and achieve either a sizing of a crop, or let's take it on the other side, if we wanted to bring our peppers into a state of, begin the flowering cycle at a relatively early period and bring them into ripeness earlier, say, August instead of October or something, you certainly wouldn't want to use the same side-dressed fertilizer. You want to use a fertilizer that's going to restrict the growth impulse and actually move the plant into that kind of flowering response. So there, we would use side-dressed materials of a more acidic nature, and certainly phosphorus is primary in that, magnesium and sulfur-rich materials. So the side dress to bring on flowering is dramatically different than a side dress material to bring on sizing in the crops. But that period, the side dressing period, is where we really start to actually fertilize plants, specifically to influence their particular growth of that crop. And so that might continue, 2 or 3 side dressings over the season, maybe just one short season crops, of course, like a salad green lettuce or an arugula. They never receive a side dressing. They're just a quick crop that comes in and goes. But something, like tomatoes or cabbages, peppers that are in the ground for a significant amount of time, and those are the crops that are getting side dressed. And so that is when actual things that we think of as fertilization materials really get utilized. There's always a carbon component. Some of them are liquid materials with various carbon materials. A common carbon material we would put into it is a compost tea or a molasses, or some of them are essentially specifically made composts, where the fertilizer materials are mixed into a specific compost to biologically activate some of those mineral components. And then the mulch is raked aside. All the crops are mulched in the field under organic mulches, so we would rake aside a little, maybe like a 6 or 8 inch to maybe a foot little area along the side of the crop. Lay down the side dress fertilizer, usually just out of buckets, and then push the mulch back over. All the better if we can water it in. And since the feeder roots of the crop are already at the soil surface because of the mulch material that's applied alongside the crop, so the feeder roots are right at the soil surface. So when we apply a solid side dress material, of course the feeder roots immediately enter the nutrient-rich materials that we put along the side of the crop. Within a day or two, you can already see the feeder roots reaching into that. Of course, it's underneath a mulch to protect that side dress solid material, and all the better, as I said, if it's watered in. So feeder roots immediately move into it. It's very accessible to the plants, and the liquid materials are applied along the side of the crop using basically, since we don't utilize a drip irrigation system because the no-till system was so effective at water management, we apply the side dress materials using basically just large hose lines, 1-inch hose lines with a fan spray end that is able to shoot a flat pattern along the side of the crop. And, you got to add enough to kind of get it through the mulch layer. But that's very effective as well. We have a simple tank system to suck all kinds of minerals and organic materials into the irrigation system. And then finally, so that we're doing dramatic influence of crop growth with side dressing fertilizers, but the real fine-tuning of that kind of growth response and how we want to further improve crops comes through the addition of very small amounts of material in a foliar feeding program. So the foliar feeding program, usually we're on a 1 to 2 week schedule during the main part of the cropping season, and the foliar program is where we introduce small amounts of very highly effective, very influential materials for insect and disease resistance enhancement, or if things need to be moved into reproduction or growth, we can enhance that aspect as well. We keep the foliar program in the realm of all edible materials so that nothing is objectionable that we would be spraying on a crop. So we consider that as an important aspect of a foliar feeding program. So they're mostly, just organic materials. Like a simple example is we would take for kind of a calcium or a calcium silicate shell-like material to harden the exteriors of the plant. We'll take eggshell and we will roast the shells. And then once the shells have been essentially kind of burned, it's kind of like making a hydrated limestone. Then we take that shell material and we introduce it to vinegar. The vinegar reacts with the roasted shell in an alkaline acid reaction, forming carbon-containing organic compounds like calcium acetate and various other reactions. So it kind of pre-processes that eggshell into a more easily biologically available form, and then that material can be used to harden just one example. I just want to give an example of kind of organic materials in the foliar program. That material is very useful for hardening the exteriors of plants against insects and diseases if that's needed. If there's too much lushness noted in a crop, extremely useful material there. Many of the foliar preparations are from Korean natural farming. So there is just some really brilliant kind of pre-fermented, one of Cho's really strong points in Korean natural farming strong points is their understanding of fermentation, and they kind of pre-process the fertilizer materials through various fermentation methods, like this vinegar alkaline reaction I was just discussing. So, they have a good grasp on a lot of different fermentation techniques over there, and so they kind of moved the fermentation concepts into a lot of pre-processing of fertilization materials. So some really brilliant stuff comes out of Korean natural farming for some really useful foliar fertilization materials. But we also incorporate some various biodynamic preparations, like a prepared silica material, quartz that is specifically processed through various approaches in biodynamics. And so we introduce some of the biodynamic materials. Horsetail tea, extremely useful for insect and disease resistance, very high silica material. The silica materials in an organic format, extracted through a simple infusion of the plant matter and then applied to the field as well. So basically, the foliar is the end kind of fine tuning of everything that has preceded. And what I often talk about is, the pre-plant fertilization material is compost based and is in terms of tonnage. And then it comes to side dressing materials along the sides of crops, and you're talking about more concentrated fertilizer materials, and you're probably applying a few 100 pounds of material through side dressing per acre, per year. And then you come to the foliar program, and it's very, very small amounts. We would never try to add your nitrogen needs through a foliar program, nor would we try to supply the nitrogen needs of a cropping cycle, well, at least a long-term cropping cycle, through pre-plant fertilization, just as an example. So those kinds of, that's the general evolution of our fertilization program in terms of, how and when and how much materials. And so hopefully that answered your question.
Absolutely, beautifully. And you go into a lot of detail on those things in the book, and it's cool to hear how you're using that water-soluble calcium from the Korean natural farming. Hey, you all, quick interruption for me and a quick word from another sponsor, Tilth Soil. Tilth Soil makes living potting soil approved for use in organic systems from food scrap, compost in Cleveland, Ohio. Tilth Soil is committed to making outstanding growing media to help regenerative and organic farmers be as successful as possible. Their blends are suitable for seed starting and germination, transplant production, and indoor specialty crops. Learn more about their products at tilthsoil.com. Our show is also brought to you by you. As patrons, you can support the work we do through patreon.com/farmerjesse or through Venmo at No-Till Growers. Just kicking us a couple bucks over there and saying thanks is super awesome. We appreciate that. Those donations are what keep the show going and growing, and at a certain level on Patreon, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to J.M. Fortier, Kevin Keene, Ryan Gosser, William Henpin, and Yannick LaPlante. Cannot say enough about all the support we get. Thank you so much. Back to Bryan. So I'm wondering if you can give us some technical details on that. Just dive in a little bit more on the composting, specifically how you make it. Like, I'm curious, adding those rock minerals and those sorts of things. Are you getting, just so I have it understood right, are you getting the soil test and then getting the amendments that are recommended and then adding those to the compost and having that work into your compost through the biology, and then you're applying that to the field at roughly the appropriate, quantities as recommended?
So basically, it is kind of a combination of things. Soil testing, we certainly do, and we've done it regularly for 30 years of farming. Basically yearly analysis. We do a double soil we use two different testing methodologies on each soil sample. So we'll run a Melic 3 strong acid extract on a soil sample, and we'll run a weak acid, either Lamont or saturated paste, which is essentially just water, extract on the same soil sample to get an idea of what various extraction materials can pull out of the soil. And we combined those with pretty regular tissue testing from our university, where we send out just leaves of plants maybe every 2-3 weeks over the course of the main cropping season, in order to kind of evaluate what's actually in a plant. So we do pretty extensive testing, and I must say that testing becomes more useful as you amass more years of collection of data, essentially, because every so often you get kind of a weird, not a good representative sample of what is actually going on. So every once in a while, something's just off. And if you only have 1 or 2 years of data, that can lead to kind of incorrect assumptions. So soil testing, although I think is very useful, and tissue testing in particular, you also have to take them with a big grain of salt. So we really like to look at all that information, and from talking to various soil scientists and different agronomists over the years, one of the best information that can be gleaned from this kind of extensive year after year testing is how things are moving in your system. With the same tests in place year after year, are calcium levels going up? Are potassium levels coming down? Or what's going on with the trace minerals over years? And that gives you an idea of how management is impacting kind of soil mineral balance profiles, as opposed to the numbers themselves, meaning specific things in terms of crop growth. So it's more useful for something that people don't really think of at first. They're thinking that number really means something, a little more maybe than they should, or it might be useful, but it might not be. What's really useful for us is kind of how everything is moving, because I must say that the soil test, particularly the Melic 3, does not often line up particularly well with what the tissue analysis is saying is actually in the plant. The Melic 3 strong acid extract is useful, say, to let you know that there is a lot of calcium in a soil, but that calcium may not be making it into a plant, as shown through a tissue analysis. And now a saturated paste may well also say that there is not a lot of calcium able to be extracted by a weak acid or a water in applied to the soil. It might well line up with tissue analysis. However, if you just ran a saturated paste test on your soils and your tissue analysis, and both of them say there's hardly any calcium, you might assume that the soils need a lot of calcium, which is not actually, may well not actually be true, because when you look at the Melic test, you realize that there is actually tremendous amounts of calcium in the soil. It's just not being brought into an available state. So, in other words, say if you just had the tissue and saturated paste and you're like, I better get a lot of calcium on this field, the volume of calcium is not the problem, and applying a bunch more calcium minerals is not going to change anything. It is a matter of bringing the calciums, which could well be in great abundance in the soil, into an active state. So, and then vice versa, if the MELIC3, even though it might show, it might not be tremendously accurate in terms of the tissue test, and the MELIC3 might show that there is actually no calcium in the soil. And then that, maybe it's, or at least having a concept that maybe there is a reason to apply a relatively large application of calcium. So with all that being said, I'm just trying to point out that, they're useful, but you can't take them don't put too much, don't think that they're going to show everything, nor particularly are they well suited to highly biologically functioning soils. So, when you were talking about, a lot of the soil testing development came from non-organic systems, essentially systems that are not highly functioning in a biological sense. And when we come into, soils that are really functioning, they can grow really abundant, healthful crops with a lot less, abundance of particular minerals than might be suspected. So that's often seen. And so that brings me to the point that really what we primarily rely on is physical examination of crops in order to determine their deficiencies and needs. So as time goes on, the combination of kind of the holistic understanding of minerals and how they influence, particular materials influence growth, the understanding of just basic the signs and symptoms of mineral deficiencies, kind of from modern agronomy, which can show you, piles of pictures of what a potassium deficiency looks like or a calcium deficiency looks like. So just to know what an actual deficiency commonly looks like, to understand in a whole sense about how these minerals influence growth, and then to combine that with what you keep seeing on your tissue and soil tests, allow you to, you don't need a tissue or soil test if you start seeing signs of calcium deficiency, which are physically obvious in a crop. And often, kind of the development of that eye for what a mineral deficiency looks like is much more useful than trying to send out tests to a laboratory, because across fields, you could have a calcium deficiency over there and no calcium deficiency over there, calcium deficiency on a certain crop because of certain characteristics, but not over there, it's a different crop. And so, and it would be very difficult to send out, but there's so many variables in production, to constantly send out samples. And it's very useful to train your eye so that you can see what a potential mineral need is in a plant through physical symptoms, because of course the response can be more or less instantaneous in terms of your agricultural production, whether it's fertilization or changing some other practice to bring that mineral back into a balanced state. So we really appreciate the physical, eye, and then we combined that with constant experimentation. So we're constantly evaluating the application of different minerals, whether that be through composting or the other fertilization materials, and that really helps develop your eye as well. So whenever we're fertilizing, we fertilize 99% of something, and we leave the other 1% unfertilized. So that's like our basic experiment that we do basically with everything, all kinds of practices all the time, that allows you to stack up what a practice did versus not doing that practice. And so you can always identify, what changes happened. And that becomes, again, that's very useful for training that eye to see the ramifications of the different materials and fertilization practices. So then that comes into composting. So composting is basically the mineral application into the compost is developed out of, I would say, primarily that eye, with certainly, the soil testing and tissue testing has guided us. However, when we're adding materials, I'm not actually shooting to influence those numbers. My numbers are not really based off of, or the volume of material is not particularly based off of what we see on those tests. The tests kind of indicate to us, maybe a calcium need or a magnesium need or something, a trace mineral need, and then we just evaluate over the course of time by adding a certain amounts of materials, kind of getting guidance from our own intuition, and obviously the trials that we apply to the field. And so, when you're talking about decades of trial and evaluation and compost application, you have the luxury of being able to kind of develop a formula. So, say you're applying a magnesium source and you're still not getting the magnesium, or you see a deficiency, or it's not, the movement is not happening across the years of soil testing, you can increase that material, particularly the rock minerals, which are very slow moving and, hard to access, and as opposed to more immediate, very soluble fertilizing materials, of course, need a little more intensive guidance and observation. But, so the movement of balance and materials is kind of a slowly evolving process, which is partly guided by the tissue analysis. But again, it's more about actual ramifications in the field to crop growth, response to various increases in formulas or decreases. So so we're constantly experimenting, and when it comes time for now mineral application to compost and how we actually build the compost, essentially we work with a lot of high carbon materials, and which is very useful for building the kind of compost that our field soils really can benefit from. Essentially, our soils are so biologically functioning that the nitrogen need of the soil is maybe less than other soil conditions where maybe there's a higher nitrogen need. The nitrogen cycle, the nitrogen fixation of the biology is very effective under our kinds of soil. So we, of course, benefit tremendously from a high carbon compost. And that's part of what I talk about in the no-till manual as well, is that once we switched into no-till and this nitrogen system is highly functioning, our needs for nitrogen, of course, went way down, and that really simplified compost manufacturing for us, because once we no longer were tilling compost into the soil, the compost doesn't need to be completely decomposed, which is really useful for a number of manufacturing efficiencies, as well as the undecomposed nature of the compost essentially feeds the soil microbiology in the field instead of the decomposition organisms in just the composting pile itself. So basically, we look at the compost as, of course, the food source, or a major food source for the field microbiology, or biology in general. And so since we can build piles that the fragments aren't fully decomposed, particularly, of course, the hard to decompose carbon materials like wood chip or maybe straw and leaf, it allows us to bulk the piles with very coarse-natured high-carbon materials like the wood chip, which allows us to not have to turn the pile and keeps the pile in an aerobic state very effectively. So really we turn the piles only to homogenize the materials. And so basically, we start out with laying down a layer of wood chips on the base, just to provide kind of a porous bottom that allows for some air down low. So we'll put down maybe a foot thick of wood chip, and then we start mixing nitrogen-rich materials and carbon-rich materials into a pile, a windrow, ending with a carbon coating on top of the pile, because the nitrogen materials always need, they're not stable, so they need constant kind of covering and to keep them from volatilizing to the atmosphere. And so we put a skin on the pile essentially of high carbon materials to finish it off. And then the pile, as we're assembling the pile, we liquefy in a slurry in a large stock tank the rock minerals that we want to add at the initial stage of the beginning of composting, and we spray them onto the pile with a heavy-duty sump pump with a big hose line. And so we got somebody stirring the slurry, somebody spraying on the minerals, and somebody's using the loader to build these piles. So, of course, the slurry gives us a good mixture, onto the pile as opposed to trying to use dry materials, and saves our lungs from exposure to a lot of we use a lot of silica materials, but a lot of fertilizers can be very aggravating to respiratory systems. So the slurry goes on, and then we have this pile, we let it heats up, but with the high carbon materials, it usually cools the high nitrogen materials, which might have preheated, we use cattle manure or vegetable scrap kind of mixed with carbon to stabilize it in these pre-piles. So the high nitrogen materials might be very hot going into the pile, 150 degrees or something, but introducing that much carbon brings the composting temperature down to about 120 degrees usually, which becomes very friendly to fungal decomposition. And so the piles become very fungal rich during the decomposition cycle. With the large volumes of wood chip and carbon materials at lower temperatures, and of course that's what we're looking for in the field is a more fungal rich type of material than a bacterial rich material, again, which might be specific to our soils the way they've developed here. That might be different on other farms. And then we turn the pile once after a few months to further homogenize the pile and introduce more mineral materials at that point in the decomposition cycle. And at the second adding is where we introduce a lot of the more hazardous to biology materials, which would be things like trace elements. We use a lot of seawater or sea salts. So a lot of the salt materials, not a lot of volume, but the trace element salts, which can be like copper sulfate or something, or zinc sulfate, which can kind of interrupt or be detrimental to biological development. They kind of go in later in the composting cycle so as not to interrupt the initial tremendous increase in biological activity in the pile. And then those materials some more of the salts go in at the turning stage, and then the pile is allowed to sit for however many months is appropriate till basically the nitrogen-rich materials are decomposed. So there's not really, you can't see cattle manures or vegetable scraps anymore, but there's still plenty of carbon fragments. And then that material goes onto the surface of the soil essentially as a compost mulch-like mixture, and then is immediately covered over with a protective layer of mulch and irrigated in and watered in so that the compost maintains its biological activity, doesn't dry out in the sun and get fried since it's being surface applied, of course, under a no-till system.
So you're kind of building these like lasagna beds essentially of compost piles. And then, it's kind of carbon and nitrogen, and then you're adding the rock minerals slurry and then carbon cap. You're letting that sit for several months, and then you're turning it just one time overall? Is that
Yep.
kind of the complete,
Yep.
in terms of turning?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I mean, that's such a simple approach, and I like it because it like I said, it kind of reminds me of like a lasagna bed. Like you're building a carbon nitrogen layers, and then you're letting that decompose, and then that's something that you can utilize on your garden. That
Yep.
Now for us, unless we're just using, since we're certified organic, we would either have to add some sort of static aeration, or we would have to turn it more, or it could include manure. But I think that's really neat. Do you have, in terms of over oxygenating, do you have a reason why you don't turn it more, or is that more a matter of necessity?
So we don't turn it more because obviously it's efficient not to have to turn your piles.
Sure.
But the fungal organisms that are developing, of course, greatly appreciate not being disturbed by turning, and the additional oxygenation of turning certainly would encourage more bacterial decomposition. So generally, since we're looking for a more fungal-rich material, and of course with the efficiencies of that kind of compost manufacturing, we go with much less turning, and simply for homogenization of materials.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, especially when you think about it like that. As soon as you start turning it and you increase the oxygen levels, then you're kind of encouraging the bacteria to start consuming and possibly releasing ammonia and those sorts of things.
Right. Which is basically the same as tillage. It's like the same kind of concept of when we come in and over aerate a soil. It's the same kind of thing. It's like making a no-till compost, literally, with not disturbing it.
Right. I love that. And earlier you were talking about, taking soil samples and then comparing them to plant samples, and then kind of taking all of that with a grain of salt to an extent, and just gathering that data. I think that's extremely important because I think a lot of people do one or the other, and I would say most people probably just do the soil testing and probably don't get into, into plant tissues. But that makes all the sense in the world, because if your soil sample says, or if your plant sample says that you have something in excess, but you don't actually have that in excess in the soil, or you actually do have it in excess in the soil, but it's not showing up in your plant tissue, that could have harm down the road when you keep applying it and it's not, being uptaken.
Oh, certainly. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you're throwing off your balance quite a bit, and then you may be locking up other nutrients.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Well, Bryan O'Hara, this has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming back on. And like I said, I'm not at all ashamed to editorialize. I really loved the book.
Oh, I can see. Great. Yep, it's doing well. People seem to really like it. It is. I do warn people. It's as you probably experience. You have a good understanding, but it's. I packed that full of information. There's not a lot of fluff in it. You probably noticed. It is a lot of very specific details and understanding, and I tried to make it very concise. And it's not particularly a beginner's manual. Some starting gardeners might have difficulty understanding it right at the start. But any kind of gardener that has some basic understandings and growers certainly seem to be benefiting, pretty well from what we got together in there.
Well, and I'll also say, I think that it's one of those books that as you read it, maybe the first time you don't get to really absorb all the information, but you can just go back and revisit it, because I've revisited it several times already since I've had the proof copy.
Right.
I keep going back to things, and they start to make sense once I start applying other things. So no, I think it's one of those books that can kind of build. And
that's what I was shooting for, Jesse.
It's great. I think you did a great job, Bryan. Absolutely. Well,
thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you again for your time. And
thanks, Jesse. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely, and best of luck on the book.
All right, thank you very much.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to go listen to my conversation with Bryan from last season and pick up a dang copy of this book. It's really great. I'll put a link in the show notes. Also, make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're getting it. It should be available wherever podcasts are available. Leave a review, but this week make sure that all reviews carry a secret message when you play them backwards. Enormous thank you to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin for all their help with the podcast and site and videos and all this stuff. Biggest thank you imaginable to my wife Hannah, without whom none of this would be possible. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye. Great. So, I guess I'm ready if you're ready.
Yep. All right. Roll 'em.